Hello my fiery friends, the Infernoman here with the latest in deck technology, and for today's deck tech we're going to be doing a small mini one for the Midweek Magic event, and we're going to be playing the most Chad and most amazing of formats when it's available, of course on Arena, Historic Pauper. So let's go ahead, let's take a deck that I thought was pretty cool to play with, and I'll show you how you can get your wins with a deck that's simply dubbed Pauper Affinity. But before we continue, if you do like any of the content that I do, please like, follow, and subscribe wherever you watch the content so you don't miss out on any of the gameplay, booster pack openings, deck decks, and so much more. Now, of course, before we get started, let's go ahead and explain briefly again the stats of the deck. We are running about a mana curve about 3.1, which does look a little bit high, but when you see how Affinity works, you'll understand why it is the way it is. We're going to be doing Azorious colors primarily of white and blue. There is a small splash of black, but we're actually not going to cast anything for the black mana cost, and you'll see why in just a moment. Of course, we are going to run 34 creatures, all artifact creatures in the deck, and specifically 6 non-creature spells, with a land base of about 20. Now, for those of you out there who may be wondering, how does Affinity work? Simply put, you're just trying to get a lot of expensive creatures out on the battlefield for a super cheap cost. We're going to highlight Mirror Enforcer as our example. So as it says right here, it has Affinity for artifacts. A spell with Affinity for artifacts costs 1 less to cast for each artifact controlled. So in other words, as we keep flooding the board, a card like Mirror Enforcer will get super cheap and effective for us, and it allows us to play a pretty decent 4/4 body for almost absolutely nothing, which is pretty awesome on our end. So in other words, we're going to then flood the board with our cards like Arcbound Mauser, Court Homunculus, Cogworks Puzzle Knot, Arcbound Prototype, Vault Scourge, Chrome Courier, Halo Hopper, and Mirror Enforcer, and this is hopefully just overwhelm our opponent with a ton of value. Specifically, these cards that you see right here, Gearseeker Serpent and Steelfin Whale, are not exactly artifact creatures, but they do get a bonus, of course, just like all the other ones. These are going to be the top end of your curve, where Steelfin Whale can come in as cheap as 1 mana, Gearseeker Serpent as cheap as 2 mana, but of course they also have additional abilities which provide for them a solid option for us at the end point of our match. So, for example, Steelfin Whale says right here, whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under our control, we untap the Steelfin Whale, which allows us to basically keep a nice blocker on defense even as we swing with it. Gearseeker Serpent, however, has a 6 mana ability that says it can't be blocked this turn. So how do we get to, of course, these? Well, as I just mentioned earlier, when we have cards like Mirror Enforcer, which can come in for super cheap, Halo Hopper, which has Convoke, which allows us to, of course, get it in for cheaper, but we have to tap our creatures in order to pay the cost. This will allow us, of course, to get these cards out much faster, sometimes as early as turn 3, to have a lot of effective big creatures. Remember that one of the biggest advantages of playing the Pauper format is there are not really any wraths in this format. So that's why we're playing a very creature-heavy deck where we get a ton of stuff out. The other cards that are going to help us provide some bonuses, as I mentioned earlier, were Arcbound Mauser and Arcbound Prototype. Specifically, these two cards have modular. What that means is they enter the battlefield with +1/+1 counters on it based upon the number. So Arcbound Prototype comes in with 2, since this has modular 2, Arcbound Mauser modular 1. When they die, you can put those counters onto a target artifact creature. So in other words, even if they do get pieced out, maybe say we can put them on, say, like our Vault Scourge, which has flying and lifelink, and we can make them bigger and more threatening to stop our opponent from getting their win. We don't exactly have any major card advantage in the deck because, again, we're just running it as simple as possible, but we do have a card, Chrome Courier. So this 3 mana Thopter with flying allows us to then look at the top 2 cards of our library when it enters the battlefield. We put one of those cards into our hand and the other card into your graveyard. And if we put an artifact card into our hand this way, we can gain 3 life. So in other words, this provides for us a great way to filter out so we can grab some of our lands that we may need to cast stuff. We may be able to get another artifact into our hand, and also helps us stabilize in the mid to late game. Otherwise, the only other utility cards we utilize is Cogworks Puzzle Knot. It provides 2 artifacts for the price of only 2 mana, and even if we have to, we can sacrifice the Puzzle Knot later on to create a servo. So this helps us put a couple extra bodies out on the battlefield, and it provides for us some decent blocking in the mid game. For our way of forcing through some extra damage, we have Bone Splitter. It may look a little clunky, of course, to say that we have to use this artifact, but it actually is pretty cheap and effective because it gives any one of our creatures a +2/+0 ability to then provide a little more extra damage to help close out any game. As far as the land base, we're going to be as simple as possible, but because we are in the historic format, we also have the advantage of taking care of the artifact tap land. So we are utilizing Mistvault Bridge, we have Goldmire Bridge, and we have Razortide Bridge as a way to increase our artifact count to ensure we can get some of our bigger stuff out even cheaper and even quicker. Yes, unfortunately, that does mean they will come into play tapped, but for some of our creatures such as Mirror Enforcer or the Gear Seeker Serpent, that won't matter too much. They will honestly be a little slow in the early game if we do get them, but remember that since you are playing Pauper, Pauper is also a much more slower format, so we do have the advantage of being able to build up stuff over time. And then otherwise you have 7 planes and 7 islands to round out the rest of the package. Otherwise, that's basically it for you for the game plan. I really don't have much else to say, except remember, this is the Pauper format, so the biggest advantage we have in this format is not to worry too much about spot removal. Yes, you're going to encounter some decks that are going to blow up our stuff, but the biggest advantage we have, of course, is since we can get out a lot of stuff very quickly, just flood the board as fast as you can to overwhelm your opponent and prevent them from taking advantage of any of the spot removal they have. Even if they blow up stuff, as long as you keep casting more and more things, your opponent will eventually run out of removal, and they won't have a way of stopping certain answers we have. One of the other things that you might want to do if you want to maintain a good strategy for this deck is just make sure that if you do know that you're going to anticipate some removal, cards like Gear Seeker Serpent and Steelfin Whale do evade some of the more common removal in the format, but at the same time, if you know they're coming, try to save them if you're able to, at least until you know for sure the coast is clear, so that way you can put them out there, provide a massive creature that your opponent just can't deal with. Otherwise, I don't really have much else to say except I hope you guys enjoy these videos. Yes, again, whenever we do midweek Magic, we do smaller, quick, to-the-point deck techs because these formats are only temporary, so that's why we don't do super in-depth ones. However, rest assured, we do have a couple more in-depth deck techs coming up down the line later in the week and in the near future, so be sure to check those out. They are going to be both some more non-budget and regular budget decks for us. But otherwise, my only final thoughts I'm going to say is I had a lot of fun playing this deck, as you can see from the gameplay. And if you are a fan of artifacts, if you're a fan of the affinity mechanic, heck, if you just like overwhelming your opponent with a great amount of value for basically dirt cheap, be sure to give this deck a try. And I assure you, once you get your wins in very quickly and finish the event, you will definitely not be disappointed. That's all I have for you today. Thanks again for watching, everyone. And just remember that no matter what you do play in the game of life, always be sure to burn bright. Later.